The world had always been unpredictable for Emily and James, but nothing could have prepared them for the heartbreak they faced after the birth of their son, Noah. He was a beautiful baby with soft blonde curls and deep blue eyes that sparkled whenever he looked at his mother. He was perfect in every way, except for one tragic truth. Noah had been born with a rare neurological condition that left him paralyzed from the waist down. His tiny legs never kicked like other babies his age, and no matter how much Emily and James wished for a miracle, there was nothing they could do to change it. Doctors had delivered the devastating news just days after his birth. The words still echoed in Emily's mind. "There's no cure. He will never walk." It was like a dagger through her heart. She had imagined so many things for her baby. Watching him take his first steps, running into her arms, climbing trees with his father. But those dreams had been stolen before he even had a chance to live them. The doctors had been kind, but their words were blunt. Therapy could help strengthen his upper body, but his lower half would remain lifeless. He would never chase butterflies in the garden. He would never race down a soccer field. He would never know what it felt like to run. James had handled the news differently. Where Emily had broken down in the hospital room, sobbing into the white sheets of her bed, James had remained quiet, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something unspoken. He was a man who had always believed in solutions. As a wildlife photographer, he had spent years capturing the beauty of nature, seeing its raw power and resilience. But this was something even nature couldn't fix. He felt helpless, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The first few months had been the hardest. Emily barely slept, waking up at every tiny sound Noah made, fearing something would go wrong. The world outside their small city apartment felt cruel, moving too fast for a child who would never walk. Friends and family tried to be supportive, but their words of encouragement felt hollow. No one understood the pain of watching their child struggle with something that could never be changed. It was James who had suggested moving away. He had spent his life exploring the wilderness, capturing images of bears, wolves, and eagles soaring across breathtaking landscapes. Nature had always been his sanctuary, the one place where life felt pure and untainted by the complications of the modern world. "Maybe we need to get away from all of this," he had said one evening, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Somewhere peaceful, somewhere where it's just us and the world." At first, Emily had resisted. She didn't want to leave the doctors, the therapists, the tiny support system they had managed to build. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that maybe James was right. Maybe a change of scenery was exactly what they needed. Not to fix Noah because she had accepted that nothing could, but to find some sort of peace within themselves. She had spent too many nights drowning in sadness, wondering why life had been so unfair to her child. Maybe if they stepped away from the noise, from the pitying looks and the constant reminders of what Noah would never be, they could finally learn to embrace what he was. And so, 3 weeks later, they packed their belongings, sold what they didn't need, and left behind the life they had always known. Their destination? A remote cabin deep in the heart of Alaska, miles away from the nearest town. It was an isolated, quiet place, surrounded by towering pine trees and endless stretches of untouched wilderness. The air was crisp and pure, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. There was no internet, no buzzing city life, just the sounds of nature and the steady rhythm of the wind. For James, it felt like home. For Emily, it was a terrifying leap into the unknown. She wasn't sure if they were running toward peace or simply running away from reality. But as she held Noah close, watching his tiny fingers curl around her thumb, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would make sure her son knew he was loved, that he was special, that his life, even without movement, was still filled with possibility. The first night in the cabin was eerily silent, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and the soft breathing of their son. Emily lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. Was this the right decision? Would Noah be happy here? Would she be happy here? She turned her head and saw James sitting by the window, his camera resting on his lap, staring out into the endless darkness beyond the trees. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the determination in his eyes. He believed this was the right path, even if she wasn't sure yet. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it secrets of the wild. Deep in the forest, something moved. Emily didn't know it yet, but this place held something extraordinary, something that would change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The morning light seeped through the curtains of their small wooden cabin, casting a golden hue on the walls. Emily woke up to the sound of rustling leaves outside, followed by the faint chirping of birds welcoming the dawn. It was their second week in the wilderness, and while she still carried a lingering unease about their decision, she had to admit there was something peaceful about being surrounded by nature. James was already awake, as always. He had a habit of rising before the sun, eager to capture the beauty of the wilderness through his camera lens. She found him on the porch, his camera slung around his neck, gazing into the vast expanse of towering trees. His expression was calm, a stark contrast to the man who had spent months wrestling with helplessness over their son's condition. Emily turned her attention to Noah, who lay in his crib, wide-eyed and alert. His tiny hands waved in the air as he cooed softly, reacting to the sunlight spilling into the room. Despite everything, he was a happy baby, always smiling, always curious. It broke Emily's heart to think that he would never crawl across the floor or take his first steps like other children. But here, in the middle of nowhere, there were no comparisons. No other babies to remind her of what he couldn't do, just their little family, tucked away from the world. After breakfast, James suggested taking Noah outside. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and pine. Emily bundled Noah up in a warm blanket and placed him in his stroller, rolling him onto the porch where they could all sit and take in the view. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, stretching endlessly over the forest, unmarred by city smoke or the constant hum of traffic. James was right. It was peaceful. For the first time in months, Emily felt like she could breathe. Days passed, and the family began settling into a routine. James spent his mornings venturing into the woods, capturing shots of the untamed beauty that surrounded them. Emily, on the other hand, spent her time with Noah, letting him experience the world in his own way. He couldn't crawl through the grass or chase after the tiny creatures that scurried across the forest floor, but he loved watching them. His eyes would light up whenever a bird fluttered by, or when the wind rustled through the leaves, making them dance. One afternoon, Emily noticed something unusual. Noah had been lying on a blanket outside, staring up at the sky, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching in excitement. At first, she assumed he was just reacting to the breeze, but then she realized he was looking at something specific, something moving near the edge of the forest. A shadow flickered between the trees. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She instinctively reached for Noah, pulling him close. She had been warned about the dangers of living so close to the wild: bears, wolves, mountain lions. The thought sent a chill down her spine. James was inside, unaware. She debated whether to call for him, but then the shadow moved again, stepping out into the clearing. It wasn't a predator, it was a bear, a large, majestic creature with thick brown fur and deep, intelligent eyes. And right beside it was a tiny cub, no bigger than a house cat. Emily held her breath. The mother bear didn't seem aggressive. She wasn't charging, wasn't growling. She was simply watching. Noah, oblivious to any danger, let out a delighted squeal. His tiny fingers waved in the air, his eyes wide with fascination. The cub, as if responding to Noah's excitement, took a few hesitant steps forward. Emily's grip on her son tightened. Every instinct told her to grab him and run inside. But something in the way the bear stood there, calm, almost curious, kept her frozen in place. The mother bear huffed softly, and just as quickly as they had appeared, they turned and disappeared back into the forest. Emily exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning. The encounter with the bear and her cub lingered in Emily's mind long after they had disappeared into the trees. She found herself glancing toward the forest edge more often, her heart both anxious and curious. Had they been passing through, or would they return? Were they dangerous, or was there something more to their presence? She knew she should have been afraid. Every survival guide warned against getting too close to wild animals, especially bears. And yet, Something about the way the mother bear had stood there, calm, watchful, almost as if she was assessing them, left Emily with a strange sense of wonder instead of fear. She didn't mention it to James right away. He was always cautious when it came to wildlife, despite spending his life photographing it. The last thing she wanted was for him to panic and insist on packing up and leaving. They had come here for peace for Noah, and if the bears weren't a threat, then maybe, just maybe, there was no reason to fear them. A few days passed, and there were no signs of the bears. Emily convinced herself it had been a one-time encounter, a fleeting moment of nature's quiet acknowledgement. But then, one crisp morning, as she sat on the porch with Noah nestled in her lap, she saw it, the cub. It was alone this time, emerging hesitantly from the shadows of the trees. Its small round ears twitched as it stepped forward, sniffing the air cautiously. Emily's pulse quickened. Where was the mother? She scanned the tree line but saw no sign of the larger bear. Noah cooed softly, his tiny hands waving with excitement as he spotted the cub. Unlike his mother, he didn't hesitate. He let out a happy squeal, and to Emily's astonishment, the cub actually flinched, startled by the sound. But it didn't run away. Instead, the little creature inched closer, its deep brown eyes fixed on Noah. Emily felt herself gripping her son instinctively, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. But something about the moment was almost surreal. The cub was fascinated, not in a predatory way, not with any kind of malice, just pure, unfiltered curiosity. It took a few more steps, nose twitching, paws pressing into the soft earth. It was close enough now that Emily could see the rich texture of its fur, the slight wobbliness in its stance, the way it hesitated like an unsure toddler taking their first steps. Noah, unaware of the tension in his mother's body, continued to gurgle in delight. His fingers flexed as if he wanted to reach out. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the cub turned and bolted back into the trees. Emily let out a breath, her heart pounding. Had she just imagined that moment? The next morning, she found James on the porch, staring out into the clearing, his camera already in hand. "They were here last night," he said, his voice low. Emily's stomach tightened. "The bears," James nodded. "I saw them from the window. The mother was watching the cabin. The cub, it came closer than before." Emily hesitated before admitting, "It came close yesterday, too." James turned to her, his brow furrowed. "How close?" "Close enough for Noah to see it," she said softly. "It wasn't aggressive, just watching." James exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've seen a lot of animals in the wild, but this feels different." Emily nodded. She felt it too. That day they decided to be extra cautious. James reinforced the cabin doors, and Emily kept Noah inside more often. But despite their caution, part of her couldn't shake the strange feeling that the cub wasn't a threat. The following evening, just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Emily was sitting outside with Noah wrapped in a blanket. The forest was still, the air cool against her skin. She almost believed the bears were gone for good. And then, movement. The cub stepped into the clearing once again. This time, it wasn't alone. The mother bear stood at the edge of the trees, watching, her dark eyes calm and unreadable. The cub, emboldened by her presence, took another step forward. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This time it wasn't just curiosity. The cub wasn't just watching Noah, it was coming to him. The air was thick with silence as Emily watched the cub take cautious steps toward the porch. Her heart pounded in her chest, her arms instinctively tightening around Noah. She could see James out of the corner of her eye, his grip firm on his camera, not out of an urge to capture the moment, but because he was just as frozen as she was. The mother bear remained at the tree line, her massive frame still as a statue, watching without any sign of aggression. If she felt threatened, she would have charged by now, but she didn't. She just waited. Emily wanted to retreat into the safety of the cabin, but something held her in place. Noah was utterly mesmerized, his blue eyes locked onto the cub's soft brown fur, his tiny hands moving in the air as if reaching out. He gurgled, a delighted sound, completely unaware of how unnatural this moment was. Then the cub did something that made Emily's breath hitch. It sat down. Right there, a few feet from the porch. The little bear plopped onto its haunches, watching Noah with wide, curious eyes. It wasn't scared, it wasn't aggressive, it was just there. Noah squealed in excitement, and Emily could feel his body vibrating with delight. She had never seen him react to anything this way before. Even when she dangled his favorite toys in front of him, he only watched them with mild amusement. But now with this bear cub, it was as if something deep inside of him had awakened. And then the cub did something even stranger. It inched closer and raised one paw. Emily gasped, her body tensing. But the cub didn't swipe. It didn't growl. Instead, it stretched its paw toward Noah's tiny legs, pressing it against the wooden porch. A single thought rang in Emily's mind. It knows. The cub didn't just see Noah, it understood something about him. James had moved closer now, his camera forgotten, his breath slow and controlled. Emily barely noticed him, too focused on the impossible moment unfolding before her. And then Noah did something she never expected. He laughed, a deep, joyous laugh, the kind that made her heart ache with love. And his toes, they twitched. It was so subtle that Emily thought she imagined it. A tiny movement, barely noticeable, but it happened. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for his tiny foot, gently running her fingers along the sole. Another twitch. A single sob escaped her lips. Noah had never moved his legs before. Not once. Not even the slightest reflex. Doctors had told them it wasn't possible. But now, after months of nothing, there was movement. Because of the cub. She turned to James, but he was already staring at Noah's legs in shock, his face unreadable. Noah, oblivious to his parents' stunned silence, continued giggling, wiggling his fingers in excitement. The cub cocked its head as if satisfied, then pulled its paw back and let out a soft chuff before scampering back toward its mother. The mother bear huffed in response, then turned, disappearing into the shadows with her cub trailing behind her. The clearing was silent once more. Emily finally let out the breath she had been holding, her hands trembling as she reached down to Noah's tiny feet. "James," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Did you see that?" James was still staring, his brows furrowed, his lips slightly parted. He shook his head as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. "That's not possible." But it had happened. Emily tried again, brushing her fingers against Noah's feet. This time, nothing. No twitch, no sign of movement. It was as if whatever force had caused it was gone. But she had seen it. She knew what she saw. James finally looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to watch him." Emily nodded, because whatever had just happened, whatever impossible, unexplainable thing had occurred, was only the beginning. The days following the cub's visit felt surreal. Emily couldn't shake the memory of what she had witnessed, Noah's toes twitching for the first time in his life. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but she had seen it. She had felt it. James had seen it too, though he refused to discuss it much. He spent more time watching Noah, studying every little movement as if waiting for something to happen again. But nothing did. Emily tried everything. She brushed her fingers against Noah's feet, placed different textures under them, even whispered encouragement to him as she gently massaged his legs. But his tiny limbs remained still, unresponsive, just as they always had. The hope she had felt that day slowly began to fade, replaced by doubt. Had she imagined it? Had it been some kind of involuntary reflex, nothing more? James never voiced his thoughts, but she could see the same conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe, but he was a man of logic, and logic told him that what they had witnessed wasn't possible. Then, 3 days after the cub's visit, something happened that shattered every doubt they had. It was late in the evening. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. The air was still, the kind of silence that made the world feel untouched and ancient. Emily sat on the porch, rocking Noah in her arms. He was dozing, his little chest rising and falling in a soft, rhythmic pattern. James was beside her, polishing his camera lens, his movements slow and thoughtful. Then Emily heard it. A rustling sound, faint but distinct, coming from the tree line. She tensed, her body instantly alert. James heard it too. his hands stilled, his entire posture shifting as his eyes locked onto the darkness between the trees. And then, just as before, the cub appeared. Emily sucked in a sharp breath. It was alone again, padding forward on its small paws, its deep brown eyes filled with the same quiet curiosity. It didn't hesitate this time. It walked straight toward them, stopping just a few feet from the porch. Noah stirred in her arms, his tiny body shifting slightly. Then, as if sensing the cub's presence, his eyelids fluttered open. He blinked sleepily before his eyes locked onto the animal, and just like last time, he let out an excited squeal. Emily's heart pounded. The cub, as if responding, stepped even closer. Then it raised a paw and pressed it against the wooden porch. Emily felt her breath catch. Noah cooed again, his hands waving, and then his legs moved. Emily gasped. It wasn't just a twitch this time. His feet flexed slightly, his toes curling and uncurling, as if responding to the cub's presence. It was more movement than he had ever shown in his short life. Her throat tightened, her eyes stinging with tears. "Noah," she whispered, barely able to say his name. James was already moving, dropping his camera as he crouched beside her. His eyes were wide with disbelief. "Do it again," he murmured, his voice raw. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she gently ran her fingers along Noah's foot. This time, his entire foot shifted. A strangled sob escaped her lips. It was impossible. It was real. James reached out, pressing his own fingers to Noah's leg, as if needing to feel it himself to believe it. And then, for the first time in 6 months, their son's tiny knee jerked slightly. James inhaled sharply. "Oh my God," he whispered. Emily clapped a hand over her mouth, her whole body trembling. The cub let out a soft, rumbling noise, almost like a sigh of satisfaction, before lowering its paw and stepping back. It turned, taking one last look at Noah before trotting back into the darkness of the trees. Emily stared after it, her mind racing. She turned to James, her voice barely above a whisper. "James, this isn't possible." James wasn't looking at her. His gaze remained on Noah, his face pale, his hands still shaking from what they had just seen. "No," he murmured. "It's a miracle." The silence stretched between them, thick with disbelief and something else, something neither of them dared to name. Emily clutched Noah tightly, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had seen it. She had felt it. There was no denying it now. Noah had moved. James sat motionless beside her, his hands still hovering over their son's tiny legs, his breath shallow and uneven. He was a man of reason, of logic, of undeniable facts. But there was nothing reasonable, nothing logical, nothing factual about what had just happened. Emily swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "James, you saw it, right?" James nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I saw it." He turned to her, eyes dark with something between awe and terror. "It wasn't just a reflex. He moved." Emily let out a shaky breath. "And it only happened when the cub was here." That was the part that made her skin prickle with unease. It wasn't just that Noah had moved. It was that he had moved because of the cub. A wild animal, a creature from the depths of the forest, a bear. James exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make sense. He's never moved before. The doctors, they said he never would." Emily's voice cracked on the last word. For months, she had prepared herself for a future where her son would never run, never dance, never even feel the grass beneath his feet. And now here they were, sitting on a wooden porch in the middle of nowhere, watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. A mixture of fear and hope warred inside her. This wasn't normal. It wasn't possible. And yet, she looked down at Noah, who was still wiggling his toes, as if unaware of the miracle happening inside his own tiny body. James stood up suddenly, moving toward the cabin. "I need to check something." Emily followed him inside, still holding Noah close. James grabbed his camera, scrolling through the pictures he had taken. He stopped on the image of the cub, its paw resting against the porch. Noah's feet visible just beyond it. He zoomed in, his brows furrowing in concentration. Emily peered over his shoulder. "What are you looking for?" "I don't know." His voice was tight. "Some kind of explanation." But there was none. That night, neither of them slept. Emily lay awake, listening to Noah's soft breathing, her mind spinning in endless circles. What did this mean? Was the cub triggering something in Noah's body? Was it a coincidence? Some strange, unknown force of nature? Or was it something else entirely? James stayed up too, his camera in his lap, his gaze locked on the window, as if waiting for the cub to return. And it did. 3 nights later, just past midnight, Emily was woken by a soft sound outside the cabin. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the distant howls of wolves. It was softer, closer. She sat up slowly, heart hammering. James was already awake, standing near the window, staring out into the night. "They're here," he whispered. Emily rushed to his side, peering out into the darkness. And there it was. The cub stood at the edge of the porch, its small body illuminated by the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. The mother bear was further back, her massive form barely visible in the shadows. Emily's breath hitched. Then, without hesitation, the cub stepped forward. James grabbed his camera, but he didn't raise it. He just watched. Emily reached for Noah, her hands trembling. He stirred, blinking sleepily. The moment his gaze landed on the cub, he cooed softly. The cub stopped just inches from the porch, and just like before, raised its paw. Emily held her breath. Noah giggled, and then his entire leg moved. It wasn't just his toes this time. His knee bent slightly, his foot jerked. It was slow, unsteady, but it was real. Emily let out a small cry, pressing a hand to her mouth. James sucked in a sharp breath beside her. "Holy!" He stopped himself, unable to form words. Emily reached down, pressing her fingers against Noah's tiny thigh. She had done this 1,000 times before, and it had always been met with nothing. But now, his muscles twitched under her touch. Tears spilled down her cheeks. James turned to her, his face pale. "This isn't just a coincidence." Emily could barely speak past the lump in her throat. "It's the cub." For the next few weeks, the same thing happened over and over again. Every time the cub came near, Noah's legs responded. Each time it raised its paw, the movements grew stronger. Emily documented everything. She filmed it, took notes, did everything she could to make sense of what was happening. But she couldn't. Neither could the doctors. When they finally took Noah for a medical evaluation, the specialists were stunned. His muscles, once completely unresponsive, were waking up. There was no medical explanation, no logic behind it. A miracle. That was the only word that fit. Emily knew the truth. It wasn't just any miracle. It was one that had come from the wild. And deep down, she knew it wasn't over yet. The days stretched into weeks, and Noah's recovery became undeniable. What had once seemed impossible was now happening before their eyes. Each time the cub visited, Noah's legs responded a little more. His once motionless limbs now twitched, flexed, and even showed signs of strength. Emily and James documented everything, capturing each moment with their camera, each tiny movement with wonder and disbelief. At first, they had hoped the doctors would have an explanation. But when they returned to the nearest town for a medical evaluation, the specialists were just as baffled as they were. There was no scientific reasoning behind Noah's sudden progress. The nerves in his lower body had been unresponsive since birth, yet now somehow he was regaining function. Doctors ran tests, performed scans, and consulted specialists, but there were no clear answers. The closest thing to an explanation was that something had stimulated his body's natural response. Something had triggered an awakening in his nervous system. But what? No therapy, no medicine, no treatment could explain it. Emily and James knew the truth. It was the cub. There was no logic behind it, and they knew if they told anyone, they would sound insane. So they said nothing. They simply returned to the cabin, eager to continue what they had started. By now, the visits from the bears had become routine. The mother bear would stay at a distance while the cub approached. There was no fear, no hesitation. It had become part of their lives. And Noah, he seemed to know too. Every evening he would become restless, almost waiting for the cub to appear. And when it did, his eyes would light up, his fingers would wave in excitement, and his little feet, his miracle feet, would move as if trying to reach out. But then, one evening, the cub didn't come. Emily sat outside with Noah on her lap, rocking him gently as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. James sat beside her, his camera resting on the table, untouched. They waited, but the forest remained silent. The next night was the same, and the next. A heavy feeling settled in Emily's chest. She knew deep down what was happening. The bears were leaving. James must have sensed it too because he didn't say anything. He simply squeezed Emily's hand, his gaze lingering on the darkened tree line. Then on the fourth night, just as Emily had started to give up hope, the cub returned. It stepped into the clearing alone, its small body barely visible under the moonlight. But this time, it didn't come as close. It stood there watching. Emily's throat tightened. She knew this was goodbye. She lifted Noah from her lap and held him up gently, whispering, "Look, baby, your friend is here." Noah cooed, his little fingers flexing, his feet moving in tiny kicks. The sight sent fresh tears to Emily's eyes. The cub let out a soft chuffing sound, a sound Emily had come to recognize as a good-natured farewell. Then for the first time, it did something unexpected. It stood up on its hind legs. James gasped beside her. The cub balanced itself for a few seconds before dropping back down. And as it landed, Noah, who had never moved his legs with force before, kicked his feet in response. Emily let out a quiet sob, pressing a hand over her mouth. The cub chuffed once more, then turned and padded toward the darkness of the forest. A moment later, the mother bear emerged from the shadows. She stood there for a brief second, her massive frame outlined against the trees. And then, just like that, they were gone. Emily stood frozen, watching the spot where they had disappeared, her heart aching with an indescribable mixture of gratitude and loss. James exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're gone." Emily nodded, pulling Noah close. She blinked back tears, but not of sadness. She whispered, "They did what they came to do." James wrapped an arm around her shoulder, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And now it's up to us." They had witnessed something incredible, something unexplainable, a connection between their child and a creature of the wild that defied reason. They may never understand it, but it didn't matter, because Noah, their son who was never supposed to move, had begun his journey towards something greater, and they would carry this miracle with them forever. Months passed and summer faded into autumn. The once lush green forest transformed into a sea of golden leaves, and the air turned crisp with the promise of winter. But inside the cabin, something even more remarkable was happening. Noah was growing stronger. His movements, once sporadic and faint, had become more frequent and deliberate. At first, it was just the occasional twitch of his toes, then a small bend of his knees. Then came the day when, as Emily held him up, he pushed against the ground with his legs for the very first time. It was weak and unsteady, but it was real movement. The doctors were speechless. Every follow-up appointment brought more shock and disbelief. They couldn't explain it. Medically, Noah's condition should not have changed. The nerves in his lower body had been unresponsive since birth. There was no scientific reason for his newfound progress. And yet there he was, moving, pushing, trying. Emily and James no longer needed an explanation. They knew the truth. The bears had been more than just animals passing through the forest. The cub had been more than just a curious creature. It had been a messenger of something beyond human understanding, a force of nature that had defied logic and rewritten what was possible. But the story didn't end there. As the years went by, Noah continued to improve. He still faced challenges, but he never gave up. By the time he was 3, he was crawling. By 4, he was standing. By 6, he was walking with assistance. And through it all, Emily and James never forgot. Hanging on the wall of their home was a single photograph, James's last picture of the cub, taken on the final night they had seen it. It sat framed above Noah's bed, a silent reminder of the miracle that had once stepped out of the wild and into their lives. When Noah grew old enough to ask about it, Emily and James told him the truth. They told him about the bears, about the cub that had come to him night after night, about the way his tiny legs had moved for the first time beneath its quiet gaze. And as he listened, Noah, now a boy who could stand, who could move, who could feel the earth beneath his feet, smiled softly and said, "I remember." And maybe, just maybe, he did, because some miracles are never forgotten. If you enjoyed this incredible story of resilience and miracles, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more heartwarming and unbelievable stories from the wild. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue bringing you the most captivating stories of nature and survival. Stay tuned for more.